Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Kasper, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. The man, he's back
Pleasure
again.
to be here. Whew. Pleasure to be here.
Okay. What's been going on in the world, man? You got a lot of stuff going on. You're doing a lot of voice acting things.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of crazy stuff. My most strangely enough, everyone's in this business, voices to make money and do whatever. The stuff I've been doing lately, that I'm getting the most fulfillment out of are like pro bono jobs or stuff that I've had some time and I went to stuff. I just did this book on an audio narrated part of a book on PTSD. And my goodness, that was very difficult. It puts you in a place where you realize that one of the interesting things about PTSD, which is I didn't realize, and this is something we were talking about after, was everybody has PTSD. Everybody has some form of PTSD from, shit that happened to you from a childhood, whether, you fell down the stairs or you were dropped as a child or you've been in a car accident.
I was hit by a jet ski and got PTSD.
Well, anyone who's been in a car accident or something like that has a form of PTSD. So it's not just war stuff because that belittles, I don't want to belittle those people, anyone in the armed forces who's been serving and they have that. But PTSD also affects a lot of other people, like maybe your neighbor across the street Mrs. O'Malley, who you kind of went, well, she's never been in the war. What the hell? Yeah, but maybe she was raped or maybe something like that. You don't know. Not to get too heavy, but so that's what this book was about. How do I say this without sounding weird?
Kicked it off with a rape and you said not to get too heavy.
No, but I enjoyed this work so much because it was heavy, I guess. And I learned a lot about myself, but also I've been doing, I'll tell you about my favorite band. I've been doing, band made documentaries that were thrown up on YouTube, which is just a hoot, because I'm learning that stuff. When you got like your favorite band, whoever they are, and the guy who's doing all the research, he goes, here you go. Here's your, your script for the week. And I'm reading it and I'm going, I didn't know that. Holy cow. It's sort of like you say you learn something about like the guys from Guns N' Roses or wherever, you go, I didn't know Axl's real name was this, kind of thing, or where's he from? So I'm learning all this stuff about this band that I've been listening to for quite a while. And you go, wow, this is, and so that's also a really cool thing where you kind of where there are people out there who are willing to, like yourself, who put in the time and you put in the research to put on a good show. They just want to entertain the public. So I think that's just awesome. But yeah, it's been crazy. It's been doing all this. And as well, the documentary I'm doing for the Discovery Channel has been picked up for another season. Yay. So I get to
what documentary are you doing for the Discovery Channel?
I do Mysteries of the Abandoned for Discovery Channel. And it's a show called Mysteries of the Abandoned, and we're going into our 9th season now, Robbie. So it's 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 all the abandoned shit that's all around the world. That's where why it's there, and to be honest, if it wasn't for the Russians and the Nazis, we wouldn't really have much of a show because they they built some crazy big stupid stuff and then abandoned them. Like one of my favorite episodes, the Russians built this huge radar thing it's almost a mile high and 3 miles long. It's called the Woodpecker because whenever they fired it up, they built it in the late 50s, early 60s. And whenever they fired it up, it made this pinging noise that could be heard from hundreds of miles. It sounded like a woodpecker going kink, 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 kink. And it took 6 normal-sized power stations to fire this thing up. And the whole point of them building it was so they could knock down cruise missiles that were coming across from the US because they were sure they were going to get attacked. So this is a big ECM thing. And then the Cold War kind of ended. And so now in the middle of Siberia, you've got this huge, big honking thing that's still there because they decided it would cost too much money to tear it down. And what do you do with it, kind of thing? So it's just sitting there in the middle of nowhere, kind of thing. So it's one of those kind of crazy stuff. All the stuff that's left over from the war, all that stuff. And even there's even stuff in the US where people kind of went a bit bonkers and built stupid things, and it's still there, kind of there. And so that's what I do.
That's interesting as hell to me. I'm wondering if they ever found Nazi gold.
I don't know if they found Nazi gold, but they found a lot of Nazi crazy stuff where where they even with they had like they had like a Nazi brainwashing hotel, which was really
Brainwashing, you say?
brainwashing, I said. Yeah. But what it was all built up to be, Hitler did some really crazy stuff where he they spent money in areas where it was like, why? What he had this kind of grand vision, but when you were talking about a couple of the episodes when you're talking about like drug uses, Hitler was pretty much stoned a lot. He was on the amount of chemicals he was into. Now I'd have to go and look at the episode that we did on that one, but they talked about some of the decisions he made. People went, "Mein Führer, are you sure?" And he's like, don't you question me? And they're like, "Oh, okay."
Have
Okay,
you seen any of his speeches? All his speeches are like he's ramped up on amphetamines.
yeah, there's a lot of that. It's the same stuff like the Germans did the stuff like when they talk about like the U-boats and things like that, but they the initial submarines that they had, like they used to send two-man subs that were quite small into like the Pacific Ocean, like to sit off the harbor, like the US harbor kind of thing. And these subs would operate for like a week before they were picked up. And these guys inside these submarines, these two men, would not sleep for a week. They would take drugs. They peed in bags. They did whatever, and they just wouldn't sleep. So when they picked them up at the end of the week, they would go, okay, report, decompress, and most of these guys got really sick or died. After imagine being hyped up, not sleeping for a week. Of course, after 4 days, you're going to start seeing shit. You're going to think that you're you're going to think that the Americans are 10 feet tall aliens sitting on the shore just watching you guys. Like, I don't. So because I've never been on a drug trip that lasted that long, so I don't know, kind of thing. But so some of the shows we do talk about, there is a lot of crazy stuff that was just built, and then when the war ended, they just buggered off. They just
Do
left
you
it. And
do you like learning that historical stuff, or do you like learning more about the PTSD stuff?
I
Because when PTSD was like before it was really, really known, did you know a film was one of the first things that opened up people's eyes to this aspect of war about PTSD? There was a there was a war film. I forgot what it was called. There was a person that wrote a book about it, and it was like in it's the 1940s maybe. Um, he wrote a film about like this war and these people that came back from it and started showing this side of this PTSD aspect. That was like the first time PTSD was ever put on screen, and it had people just like, what is this is what happens to our veterans and our people that come back from war. And it just opened up this like, and it's not that crazy to think that film has that much of an impact, because then you look at like Oliver Stone's film. He made a JFK film that literally had a bunch of people write to congressmen to start literally the creation of the Assassination Records Review Board about unredacting documents and releasing it to the public, all these disclosed documents that were stored away for so long. And it's like, so film can really set the mood and impact something. But
oh,
yeah,
it's amazing. I think that when you when I was growing up, like in the 70s and the 80s kind of thing, all the movies were about which is interesting, ties into what you were talking about last night, how there's a generation now who don't remember like Vietnam or anything like that. And I think back
John
like
Lennon, they don't remember John
well, yeah,
Lennon.
and I was, quite young, and I was like 11 in the 70s when a lot of this was going on, but I still remember it, sort of thing. I remember the moon launches and all that, or the moon landings, and you know conspiracy theories aside with those kind of things.
Alleged moon landings.
Alleged. I remember the launches. I remember the launches from Houston or what we were shown. And but you now you've got people who are like, like sort of like the ones who are like, like the first Star Wars movie, The Phantom Menace. And you go,
Yeah.
okay, we have a whole bunch of people who you're missing 3 movies. Really? And it's like, "Oh my god." And so, or the ones who, when they hear a song on the radio, I go, "That's a remake of this song." And they go, "Is it?" And you go, "Yeah, it is." And or how we sort of went through this period of like, this is remake cycle, like the like 2010s to 2020s, was like there was a lot of remakes. Well, where I'm getting at is a lot of the movies were about, you had, it was about Vietnam. You had like Platoon, another Oliver Stone movie. You had, um, showing how crazy and bad and everything Vietnam was. And then, the last Vietnam movie they had, wasn't it about, there's a guy who's trying to bring a cooler full of beer.
Oh yeah, the greatest beer run.
Yeah. And so you kind of go, it's sort of taking a tongue in cheek sort of look at the whole thing, but still, there was some heavy stuff in that one. To go back to your question, what I l
I asked a question.
yes, you did. You went to, was it the PTSD thing or the history thing? And what it is I kinda like both, where the PTSD thing, what that really, as I was mentioning in our earlier, when we were talking earlier, how you realize that, um, there could be stuff going on with people that we know that we have no idea, kind of thing. Like, when I was mentioning that everybody has PTSD, they have some form of PTSD from something that they've had. So when I was learning about this in this book, where I saw this, part of the book is about that, because it's about different forms of PTSD and what it is. Now, myself, I've never served. I don't know that type of PTSD, but I've had shit happen to me where that's affected me, like, which we've talked about before, kind of thing, where um stuff in my family that were has happened where you're that provides a form of trauma, kind of thing. So it's like how that people don't know about because they've never heard of. So it's how that, but I love that whole thing, like the whole perspective thing, how someone, how 3 people can look at the same thing. What is it? The Aesop told a fable about 3 blind mice who come across an elephant. And one of them's like, "What are we looking at here?" And one's feeling around the leg going, "I think it's a tree." And the other one is feeling the trunk and's going, "No, it's a snake." And the other one's sort of along the side of the elephant going, "No, I think it's just a big wall." And it's an elephant, but because they have no context and they don't know what it is. And I think a lot of people deal with situations like that where, like, the internet is full of stuff like that these days, where they'll be shown a picture of something and you go, "It's a tree. See this thing we're talking about, it's a tree, we're a tree." And then there's all these posts about, "Did you see that tree? Did you see that tree?" And then people are like, "What, you mean the elephant? That's what are you talking about?" You kind of like, where it sort of ties into all the trolley aspects, or how someone will say something on the internet and go, "See, it's this thing." And about 18 other people will go, "Yeah, it's this thing." And I'll go, "Did you even look at the picture? Did you even look at it?" It's like, "Well, no, I don't have to look at it. I trust the person who did the post." So I'll go, "Yeah, I'll just agree
It's
with it."
blind faith.
Yeah, there's a lot of, and so the I think what, in many ways with your question, like doing a show like Mysteries of the Abandoned, first, I'm amazed by the efforts that everyday man and woman and person, whatever, will go through to build shit, but also to hide stuff, to like the secret this, and but also how there is still so much out there where there's a building out in the middle of nowhere and you find it and you go, "What the fuck was this thing for?" Kind of thing. Like you go, "Why why did we what who made this?" Kind of thing. And then you kind of think back, it ties back to, like, older civilizations, and you go, they're getting measurements that are like laser, l- you know, laser accurate. And it's almost like we went through a dark ages where people lost their ability to do that. And or it's almost like someone reached down and took it, whatever the toys were, away and went, "We're not going to let you guys play with this stuff anymore, particularly you Aztecs. Stop with the blood sacrifice? What is that? Stop that." And so they went in and they took away all their, their measuring tools and their whatever, and you kind of so everyone else is going, "You guys, we had it so good." And so now we have to start again with sticks and
Well, look at the payphone. To try asking a person to do a payphone that wasn't around in that time, they don't know how to work the thing. They might know how to plug certain things in to make it on, but to do a call, it would be confusing. I've seen TikToks of that type of stuff, but you're moving forward, but you're not ready to move forward 100% completely. There are people that like the way that the routine is, and now it can improve your life, or it could just be another hassle trying to get a cell. Like I rarely use my cell phone. Probably the only person of my generation that does it, mostly because my screen is so cracked and I could go get it repaired, but I'm not dealing with people at Verizon. It's a hassle and a half to, transfer your contacts and do all this type of stuff. And they make it, oh, an extra fee. Okay. I just don't need my phone then. So it's like, I mean, I think
well,
people,
I think it's the only thing that Star Trek sort of predicted well, because I mean, a lot of sci-fi writers, one of the things they talk about with sci-fi writers is even the ones who are writing in the 30s and 40s, no one predicted the personal computer. No one predicted kind of the internet. They kind of did a thing, but no one predicted the PC, and everything was still being printed on paper and stuff. But Star Trek had their little flip up thing, beam me up, I can talk to anywhere. Now, this whole thing on the chest thing, that gets me so much because I go, how does that thing know who I want to talk to? Like it's, I just click on it and go
what are you
bridge
talking
and
about?
it's,
Wait, what?
like, well, Star Trek, they got their badges where they tap on their badge now,
I've
right?
never seen Star Trek.
Oh my gosh, bro.
I'm a Star Wars fan, bro.
Well, it's that type of thing where, I saw something so disturbing the other day, but it tells you the evolution of it was a TikTok thing. And a guy said, listen, I did this experiment. He goes to his wife and he goes, hey, honey, pretend you're making a phone call. And he goes, okay, now hang up. And she goes, and then he goes to his 8-year-old daughter and says, who is actually, no, his 12-year-old and said, can you pretend you're making a phone call? And she went like this. And he went, okay, now hang up. She folded her phone over because she's used to the fold phones. And then he went to his 8-year-old son and he said, okay, pretend you're making a phone call. And he goes, okay, now hang up. And that whole evolution, it was like, nobody does this anymore. It's like, hey, call me, call me.
I
Now you
do
have to
that.
go,
That's how you do it. You got the receiver thing right here.
yeah, exactly. Because now you have to do, hey, call me, call me. Well, you look like an idiot. Call me, call me.
I mean, you still look like an idiot if you're holding up a fake phone to the side of your head.
Yeah, hey, call me, call me. It's like, what are you doing? What is this surfing thing? So I love that kind of stuff. So it's just, yeah. So the show has been that type of stuff. I learned a lot. I love learning about the craziness of people kind of thing, but and how certain, even the conspiracies that are in that. Like one of the shows we did was about how Edison and GE ganged up against Tesla. Tesla's uh Tesla's lab is somewhere. Is it in? I think it's in New York, where and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. It's all Art Deco with glass and and the stuff. But Tesla did something kind of silly because Tesla went, "I want to give away stuff for free." He goes, "I want energy to be free," and GE and Edison went, you cannot give it away for free. We must charge. And you're like, no, no, I want the people to have it. Because can you imagine how much prosperous our society would be if people didn't have to pay for energy? And you could just see the energy companies going, ha!
Well, it's the thing you just said to me earlier before we started recording, which was like that how I come at it with like no bias when I do an episode or something like that. Like someone will see a guest I have on and go, "What are you, a Democrat or what are you, a Republican or what are you this?" I don't even that doesn't even cross my thought process. I'm just looking at this individual. I don't consider you by a political opinion, but people see that and they go, "I don't have the same political views, so I don't want to do this and that." I don't think about that. It's the exact same thing. And it's like it's weird because I like Tesla because Tesla obviously had a bunch of great. He had a death ray invention that never fully got made, but he had an idea for it. Then he married a pigeon as well too, where he was in a relationship with a pigeon. There's a bunch of weird stuff, but I find that very interesting. I like the historical like information like that. Like there's a conspiracy out there, and it's I don't know if it's a conspiracy. Honestly, there's two versions I can tell you, and honestly, they could probably both be plausible. So J. Edgar Hoover There was a book by Anthony Summers, who I was gonna talk to at one point, but he actually changed his opinion on the assassinations, so yeah, I think he went more straight shooter, or he's writing another book or something like that. Well, he put in his book that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser and that the mob had photos of him. So Hoover never acknowledged the mob, never even told any of the police people to go into that. So there's the conspiracy aspect that, okay, allegedly the mob has photos of J. Edgar Hoover. So Hoover says the mob doesn't exist, so nobody will investigate into it and they'll worry about other things. Now, everyone knows that Hoover's main threat was communism. So he was very looking for everything when it came to communists. He wanted to root all those people out because he believed that that would be the fall of democracy. So then we get to the point of what the truth is. The truth states that Hoover didn't want to have his police force or FBI agents investigate these mob connections because it was a waste of time and communism was a bigger threat. So he wanted the police states to handle their own mafia organizations in their states, let the local police do it. That makes sense. I don't know about the thing, but here's where I start bringing up a lot of line of questions. That is the best excuse to get out of a fact that the mob might have pictures of you as a cross-dresser, and people go, "Well, that's conspiracy." Well, let me give you another one. There's a show called Wormwood. Now, I was going to have Frank Olson's son on to talk about it. Frank Olson fell out of an 11-story building high on LSD. He was involved in the MK Ultra projects. Now, Frank Olson's son, Eric, didn't know that he was just told his dad fell out of a 11-story building. It was a suicide attempt and he overdosed or something like that. There's a bunch of things that wasn't adding up to the story. Well, in the Watergate hearings, they found out that during the MK Ultra project that one of the scientists was given LSD and killed by the CIA. So he's been suing the CIA for the past, like, I don't know what it is, like 30 years or something like that. And they made a show about it called Wormwood. It's on Netflix. So when I was looking at this and I go, they didn't say the guy's name at all. They just said that a guy fell out of an 11-story building. So how do you know it was your dad? And he goes, well, there was only one personalist. It happened to multiple other people, but there was only one recorded case, and that was Frank Olson. And you start going, now they ruled it as a suicide thing, but what they did was in the show, they talk about it. What happened is all the scientists were in this like little like meeting room. They were talking about what, everything that the project was going to be. And he goes, well, to understand what it's going to be like if one of our spies are kidnapped by another force, Russia or whoever, and they're going to be interrogated with these drugs. So it'd be best if we understand them deeper. And you go, okay, that makes sense. Well, when he said that, he goes, one of us is about to trip out. And everyone's like, what? And he goes, I slipped one of these drugs into your drinks. And the guy like slowly starts going, you're joking. And you see the room start spinning in his eyes. And then he was never right after that. And his family they explain this all in hearings and everything about how he slowly started changing over the next couple of weeks and months. And he became like very silent, very disturbed, to the point where they go, I think we need you to see a psychiatrist. And he goes and sees a psychiatrist, you would think to check out his mental health, right? Well, not even a couple weeks later, he falls out of an 11-story building high on LSD, allegedly committed suicide. You start going, did they make him go see a psychiatrist to seem like he needed help and it was documented? And then they did that to him? And that's the thing, is that in the Watergate hearings, they proved that he was killed by the CIA. Now it's about getting justice to his family and compensation for that as well, too. But you look at how, like, okay, if Kasper, if you're, if I'm giving you a drug and I work for the government and you start going crazy, and I just say, all right, we're going to need you to see a psychiatrist. You're like, all right, I guess you guys want to get me help, right? Then you go see one, and then I go, oh, well, he knows too much, and he's obviously a risk. I might as well get rid of him. And then I get rid of you, and they go, oh, he committed suicide. Nobody's going to question because earlier in the couple of weeks before, it's documented you went to the psychiatrist. So it's like, it's really, really difficult when you start going conspiracy and when it's real. And it's like, I believe there's a sliver in truth in a lot of things, but then also there's really smart strategies. And to me, that's a very smart strategy. And I feel like if I explain it like that to some people, they could just roll their eyes. But I feel like that makes a lot of sense. Like, it's a very dark thing to do, but also, I mean, how many people know your fucking middle name in the government? Do you think they honestly care about your feelings? Like, that's what I just try and bring up is like everything can be logically talked out because there's prior evidence to show it before. I mean, the Nazis were terrible. We forgave the Nazis for their experiments because they had research. And it's like, well, now we don't have to do the research. That's the Nuremberg trials. Well, go to the darker side of Nazis, the ones that are way worse than the Nazis. Unit 731,
Yeah, and they had
splitting people.
look at I think you've had it on one of your shows earlier. A huge majority of the missile and space program, they were all Nazi
Yeah.
scientists.
Wonder von Braun.
The guys who, yeah, Braun, who was shelling London with his V2 rockets kind of thing. So the whole when they brought him over, it's like, yeah, it's okay. So it's I suppose a lot of that stuff you were talking about, you can dismiss as it was a different time. And I think you talk about when we were talking about movies and things from different eras where you kind of go, they were doing stuff in those movies in like in the 60s and 70s we couldn't show today because it either either it's too sensitive or they were talking about stuff that we just wouldn't talk about today. And now you kind of when you're talking about like the conspiracies and stuff like that, you can't go, well, it was a different time and governments did different, they had to do stuff to get stuff done. And you're like, well, no, they
Well, the
didn't.
the Pearl Harbor movie, that you would feel like if you made a movie about Pearl Harbor, you want it to be accurate, right? Well, the government had to go to Japan and they go, here's the film that we made. And Japan got to say what stayed in and what's got taken out. I think Bob Herzberg, when he was on here, talked about it. He said he found an FBI file about Pearl Harbor. And one thing that they had is, I think it's Kate Blanchett or whoever the hell it was that was on the ship. And behind her is a guy in the background. He gets lit up by a machine gun and like literally explodes into bits. Well, Japan was like, take that out. And they're like, why? And he was like, take it out because you don't need that extraness. And it's like you're sitting there going, okay, so now we talk about the influences of scripts and movies in Hollywood, right? Sounds conspiracy when you say it like that, but then explain the evidence. Well, the evidence is if Japan said take it out and we don't take it out, there's things that we did say this is staying in here, and that is a lot of the destruction in Pearl Harbor. But it could have been a way worse movie for Japan, but Japan had a say so of what gets put in. And you got to think if we don't do what they say, or if we don't abide by some of their rules on taking things out, then we're going to be at war. So now it's avoiding a war. Well, look what the whole Cold War, look what the whole Nixon versus the war on terror, the war on drugs. It's all avoiding war, but creating its own domestic issues.
Yeah. The thing about that, just not to downplay any of the Pearl Harbor stuff, but people forget there was previous movies. There was Midway and there was Tora Tora Tora. And Midway was told from the American point of view, and Tora 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 was told from the Japanese point of view. And when these movies were made in the 70s, both the movies point out mistakes that were made by both governments and both navies. There was assumptions made, there was mistakes made, which is, reasons why the Pearl Harbor attack was sort of allowed to happen in the first place because little the I think Midway kind of played it off as coincidences. Like one of the things was the guys at the who were supposed to be manning the radar decided to go home early, and so they locked up and didn't see the planes coming. And there was a message that was given to military and command in Pearl Harbor, or saying there's going to be an attack. We've decoded it, and it sat in the inbox for the weekend because everybody kind of went home, kind of thing, and didn't get it, kind of thing. The Japanese envoys were sitting in the office of these are just all in the movies. The Japanese envoys who were sitting in basically the what you call the embassy office or whatever, sitting there going, listen, we need certain concessions or we're going to attack. And these envoys were made to wait 2.5 hours in the waiting room. So they ended up just leaving and not delivering their message, which was, we're going to attack Pearl Harbor unless we get certain things. We want certain concessions in the war, kind of thing. Give this up, do this. And it's interesting how in these movies they do kind of you'd never get that nowadays kind of thing where, but and I think you talked about it earlier where you said any movie that you're doing that has military in it, the military had to have some say in it.
We got files on Platoon. It's on the FBI website.
Yeah, and I'm sure Midway, because all that hardware that's in that movie in the '70s was all I don't know a lot of rich people who just happen to have some aircraft carriers in their marina that they could lend out for filming, kind of thing. So all all the hardware, all the stuff that they used, the actual ships that they used were the actual ones that were, some of them were, dry docked, but they used like the Hornet and the Yorktown and all this. They use these, and even in Japan where they had the Yamato and all this stuff, and they had, the some of it was stock footage, yes, but they did kind of highlight how there were mistakes. Now, how they played it up in the movie was these are human errors that happened, and as a result of these human errors, this tragedy happened. Even Midway, when they show that Japan is coming and we're going to attack Pearl Harbor, um, kind of, and this is where you kind of wonder because there's a great scene where it's that scene where the Emperor of Japan says, um, "I think we've awakened the sleeping giant," which was when they attack Pearl Harbor. They basically bring the U.S. into the war kind of thing, because before that, the US was sort of doling out they were doling out troops and things like that, but they weren't really invested in the war until 1942 and or 1941. And it's just very interesting stuff where they talk about there's people going, I don't think this is a good idea on both sides. Like the Japanese emperor was going, I really don't think this is a good idea, you guys, targeting Pearl Harbor without warning them kind of thing, which is why he sent the envoys and stuff. He goes, "You at least need to tell them. Even if you tell them, and then half an hour later you do it, we've given them because if you just sort of attack them, that's there's no honor in that. This is again, the Japanese were very much about honor and all that stuff. So there was that whole aspect. And then Tora 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 is about the Japanese kamikaze pilots and how they kind of dealt with that. But this whole aspect of how this is a clusterfuck, like how they went, and it was, and so you have some really
I couldn't
interesting, but
imagine how doped up you had to be to fucking take your plane and just ram it right into something, knowing you're not gonna
again,
make it.
some of that was it's just their belief, like
They were
it's the
drugged up. There was a lot of them that were drugged up.
some of them, but some of them weren't, and that's what Westerners don't understand about Eastern religion. Like, watch any Japanese, Chinese, Korean hero movie. Who dies at the end of the movie? The hero. They always do. There is no happy ending. The happy ending is the hero gave their life so that everyone else could live. That's how their movies go, kind of thing. Whereas in Western culture, it's like, no, no, he's got to get the girl and you got to, drive off into the sunset. He's sort of very Blade Runner where he's, in the car driving off, whatever. That doesn't happen in Eastern culture. In Eastern culture, you're in order to win, you need to give everything, including your life. And that's just how it is. So a kamikaze pilot wouldn't need to be doped up to do that. The amount of adrenaline and stuff when they're doing that would just be, I'm doing this. And in fact, a lot of pilots, when they left, a lot of the family said, see ya. You're not coming home, kind of thing. And in fact, sometimes if you came home, you were chastised by your superiors. You were like, so
Well,
you didn't do
it's like
you
the
didn't do your
Vikings. The
job.
Vikings believe that they died in battle and you go to Valhalla or whatever. But the family, I mean, it's an honorable death is what they call it. So a lot of people like also killed themselves with their swords rather than being killed by the enemy. It was seen more honorable to take your own life. It's fucking confusing, but it adds in a whole other aspect. I think understanding that cultural perspective is important, but I think it also, I mean, just talking about the way that like we're told history versus the way like when you actually research into it and look into the deep aspects of it, you start uncovering a lot of stuff. Like, I mean, I've even started to think about the mob differently. I mean, if you look at like Japan or you look at China or something like that, somebody dealing with the triads. Now, the triads are more powerful than the government is in a lot of aspects of things. They don't, those two don't ever cross. And you get to this point of like, that could have happened here if the mob was let to go out there. I mean, history tells you one thing, tells you the mobs are these horrible gangsters and they were going to kill anybody. Well, no, they were just people that wanted their own power and also was trying to rise up against the government to be like a government, but a government of people. And you start looking at like what the mob was doing. Al Capone was feeding soup during the Great Depression and shit like that. Like, he was helping people that didn't have food. And you're like, why would Al Capone do that? Well, he's winning the favor of people. You look at Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar, horrible person, I guess, but also he built soccer stadiums and things to make his people happy just
So
so they didn't revolt against
you
him.
guys you guys actually talked about that in the last episode I was watching where you had, I can't remember the guest you had on, but he was mentioning, he was talking about churches and how churches when they were first.
Oh, Don.
Yeah, but when they were first meant to come out, churches did good things. I mean, churches were community. You commented on it. You said the whole point of a church was community and the stuff they put into stuff. But then, when you were also talking about the war on drugs and the how he brought up prohibition and things like that. And prohibition was the result of you had some teetotalers who were in the office, like who basically we need to ban this stuff, but also at the same time they were hoping to get rid of certain individuals who were known maybe drinkers or alcoholics, and all it did was it pushed everything under. And in many ways prohibition brought about organized crime. Like when they talk about organized crime, whereas before there was crime, but then when everyone had to go under and start being more calculating, then crime became organized. And so now the mob is known as organized crime. Like, what does that mean? Like, there's crime, but then there's organized crime. Then what's the difference? And the difference is the when you go under, uh, and when you had all the speakeasy and stuff, and you mentioned bootlegging, it brought up bootlegging, and but not just bootlegging, it brought up the transportation of booze, smuggling, all this stuff, and it opened up. Not only are they just smuggling booze, but later on they're smuggling in guns, people, all the trafficking that went in, all came about because of prohibition. Whereas here you had some lovely well-minded people who didn't have a fucking clue of what they were doing, or what they were just like, no, we just need to stop this. We just need to ban it. And sort of like the same thing with drugs, where when they were going off after certain individuals, you just went, no, no, because sometimes if you just put a blanket stop out, people go, well, no,
There's
why?
there's a really good movie you should watch called Lawless with Shia LaBeouf and Tom Hardy and a couple other people. It's three brothers they basically run a moonshine business. And around this time is when the prohibition kind of first started. And they were like, every sale of alcohol you do has to go through us and we get a cut of it. And they were like, we're not fucking doing that. And it's like this whole like everyone else in the area is kind of selling like, okay, we got to go through the main boss now. We got new rules to play by. And this one group of brothers just doesn't do that. So they try and take them out. I mean, they hire people to make their lives hell. They hire a dude to slice another brother's throat. He ends up surviving and all this stuff. And it's like, I mean, look at like the government wanted Castro out at one point, and then they decided to work with the mob. So they cut a deal with the mob. So JFK had a deal with the mob. We're going to go into look, there were 693 assassination attempts on Castro. Okay. All of them failed because Castro's security did their job. They made sure Castro was aware and noticing like he didn't drink his favorite tea one day because they knew they slipped some type of heart attack poison in it. But then okay, so you say, okay, they had a regime change strategy. And what the government's regime change strategy would do would be hire some of these mafia agents and some of these secret agents that work for the FBI and CIA, go into a country and get the people to want to rebel against their leader and overthrow their own dictator. The reason for that is we have no involvement in this. So it's the people that are rising up. So they were giving the people, the resistance troops down there guns, they were giving them drugs, they were giving them whatever the hell they needed to get rid of Castro. It didn't work. But then you say, okay, so Castro's security helped him not die by the mob or whoever was trying to kill him, the American government. But then you look at Kennedy. Well, so if they used one of those plans to kill Kennedy and it worked, that's a fault on the security, right? And then you look at Kennedy's drive past the book depository building. None of the rooftops were checked like they were supposed to be checked. Nothing was done the way the Secret Service should have done it. and you start realizing, okay, so his security was a little too lax. And people bring up the bubble top. It's a dumb example because the bubble top wasn't bulletproof. Anybody could have shot right through it, but it still deters people from going, that might be bulletproof. Most people thought it was. And I think it gets into this aspect when you start looking at organized crime, the mafia working with the government. I mean, they had the similar goals in mind. J. Edgar Hoover was one of the people that also, you know, didn't acknowledge the mob, but also was working with them on certain tactics of sorts. And eventually, around Nixon's time, you start seeing that kind of phase
Well,
away.
you could see Hoover, like, there's it's a very interesting, like, you have the movies that have come out, like the Godfather movies and stuff, and even Goodfellas is an example of when they talk about the mob. Now, again, I'm not in the mob. I'm just pulling this off from what I've seen, kind of thing. But you had the mobs tended to be not very friendly about drugs. Alcohol, sure, all that stuff, but they weren't they a lot of them were supposed to be very Catholic, very religious, very there's certain things that, even though, when you talk about, "Yeah, but they killed so many people." Yeah, that's what confession's for. That's so but don't even go into the whole Catholic thing about that. It's like, you can do whatever you want and then just confess it, and then you're going to heaven, yay. It's all good. But they were kind of anti-drug, and I can imagine if Hoover or whoever was in there was very anti-drug. So he goes to someone else who, even though they're a crime family or organized crime, and says, "You guys are anti-drug, right?" Like, "Yeah." It's like, "Okay, I have something I would like you to do." Um, and, I can imagine how they could kind of get to bed together about that kind of thing where, because even, they could kind of go, because, a lot of these drugs, they come from Cuba. You knew that, right? Yeah. And they're like, oh, and well, I imagine they're smarter than that, but it's the same. I can see how they could get there at the same time. Yeah. The whole,
Well, the
let's use,
mob wanted Cuba because that's where Cuba. You could think of Cuba like Nevada or Las Vegas. It was a place where all these presidents would fly down there, and a bunch of people would go down there, and you'd win a lot of money. And the reason why Castro was getting pissed off and why they saw Castro as a problem, when he was like, "Why the fuck are people coming over to my land and making a bunch of money in my place, and then what? I'm not getting a cut of it at all." And he didn't like this encroachment of foreign people onto his land and just using it as like a casino. And it pissed off the mob, and that's why, and it pissed off the mob and the government. And they were like, okay, well, we need, our money. So you're messing with our money now. So now there's a money incentive. But I think when it came to drugs and gangs, that was a strictly gang thing. But that also has a lot of evidence to show that LSD and heroin and all these things, they were given to gangs by FBI informants for a reason. There's a thing called blockbusting, which blockbusting was just knocking on people's doors back in the day and saying, hey, you have this certain ethnicity moving in. You better sell your home before your property value goes down. My grandfather used to talk about this all the time. He was like, I don't give a shit about that. Like, it's my fucking home. My grandpa built it. And so people wouldn't sell, and it was this fear of like your property value is going to go down because you have a certain area of ethnicity moving in. And when you get to the drug aspect, blockbusting with drugs, you brought heroin into a neighborhood, you got people addicted to a difficult drug that only grows in like one of two places. It's heroin grows in Vietnam and heroin grows in Afghanistan, and two of the longest wars we've ever had were Vietnam and Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Yeah. And they've talked about, how the American government supplied, the troops in Afghanistan with weapons, against the Russians, and then the Russians came in and they supplied weapons against the, and even then, from what I understand, Castro was getting help from the Russians at one point, I think. I read
No,
about it. So,
well, they wanted to invade Cuba as well
yeah,
too.
well, yeah, but they wanted to help, and Castro at the same t Castro was like, "Look," again, from what you said, he was like, "Look, I'm sick of people coming in and taking my stuff." He goes, "No, this is my stuff." He goes, "You can give me stuff." He goes, "If you wanna give me stuff to help me boot the Americans out, sure." "No, you can't keep that, that's mine."
Well,
And
all of our history is fucking accidents. That's the thing. It's like penicillin, accident. You look at a lot of the wars we fought. We started stockpiling nuclear missiles because we got a bad intelligence tip that Russia was stockpiling nuclear missiles. Turns out it wasn't true. Eventually, we had way more than Russia did. Russia goes, okay, now we got to catch up. And then they started doing this missile race type thing. I think that leads into the whole Cold War aspect of thing. But people think the Cold War was just this war that wasn't fought like by weapons, and it was like this idea of like one day we could be gone tomorrow by a nuclear missile, which is mutually assured destruction. This idea that my buddy has his finger on the missile trigger. And we got to keep ours on there in case something happens. We can try and fire back. Well, it was an intelligence war. They were just stealing each other's information. That means that you look through documents. There's fake documents, thinking that people were spying on you and infiltrating your base. They'd run off with a fake document that led to men who stared goats, the whole freaking psychological creation of mind warrior Jedis, and then the bioweapons thing. Bioweapons ended. We had a bioweapons ban treaty or whatever. Honestly, in my opinion, if you look at the documentation, I think it was because they realized that we're wasting a lot of money to make this stuff, produce it, and then store it, and we're never going to use it, because launching a biological weapon on in World War II or something like that, you just see the Germans put on fucking
That was
gas masks.
that was a great episode you had with that guy who, when he was talking about all the, he said, he goes, "People talk about bioweapons and, what they did was, but they're very ineffective. And, like, you can't, it rains the day you wanna drop the gas. Well, you're screwed because it's not gonna
So
work."
if me and you are two countries right now, and we know that we're spending way too much money into this, it's not effective at all, and it's just biting us in the ass to try and store it where it all goes to waste and we have to produce more. So what do? We go, let's make a treaty to not use biological weapons. In our minds, we're thinking this is going to save us so much, but it's seeming like we're giving up a major advantage. We're not doing anything. And then the public sees it and they go, oh, they really do care about us. It's like, well, no, they just wanted to save money. They don't give a shit
Exactly,
about going
they're
to
saving
war.
money. In fact, one of the sides, I'm not sure if it's me or you, is thinking, "We should probably sell this stuff."
The UK hired us to make anthrax fucking bombs. And it's crazy because that factory, it's called the Vigo Ordnance Plant. It was sold, it was shut down and it was sold to Pfizer. And Pfizer bought it because I think there was 8,000 pounds of anthrax stimulant or something like that, which,
Yeah, and
yeah.
because where do you get anthrax from?
Well, that's our main fear now with biological weapons
Well,
is
no, where do you get it from? Sheep, and you don't have sheep. Yeah, that's where that's where it comes from. So, anthrax, you can't get it, or the from something inside, decaying sheep or something. You have to process it a certain way, but that's where it comes from, and that's why you can't, it's not gonna come from cattle, kind of thing. So, you have to it's why the US would approach somewhere like the UK, which is tons of sheep over here, kind of thing. So you
yeah, but you guys handle conspiracies different than us.
yes, they
You
do.
guys fucking like talk openly about conspiracies, and they're not even, it's not seen how, like, when we say conspiracy in the States, people go, oh, flat earth, and they'll roll their eyes. When you say conspiracy over there, people go, yeah, there's real conspiracies. And you guys will just start talking about, like, but the weird thing is our government, we have way more of a closer eye on what our government does and more transparency in that aspect. Your government's secret as hell, but you guys know shit's going on, and you
Well,
guys
this,
just like
MI5 and MI6 and all that. But, well, for example, one of the things you had, that it was a few years ago now, but you had that Russian
Novichok
ambassador,
incident.
yeah, well, and his daughter who were poisoned, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
on a
And
doorknob. You guys
well,
blame the Russians.
they've traced it back. They didn't really blame the Russians. They blamed two guys who happened to be Russian, because they kind of proved they did it.
Conspiracy.
Where it shows them, but
Keep that
like,
conspiracy off my
yeah,
show. I don't
yeah,
want to hear I
but
just can't
again,
see how annoying that is, though. Someone
exactly.
calls it
And it's
conspiracy.
so it's the type of thing I wasn't, again, I'm not there, but they drew the lines and they said, well, here's these two guys. Well, we know where they're from and we know who they work for. But even Russia was like, oh no, we didn't ask him to do it. That's that was, at the time, is like, no, if they chose to do that, that was on them. It was that kind of thing. And so if that happens, then you kind of go, okay, well then where the hell did they get the the radioactive material from, which is very expensive and very hard to get. And both of them survived. So it's, in many ways, conspiracies don't really exist if there was an attempt, and then it's kind of blown over now, kind of thing. You kind of go, well, they got sick and this is what happened. And um you kind of have to go, are we sure that this is what they had, kind of thing? It's, because you only have the newspaper report saying that they were affected by, radioactive material, because from what I understand about that is, once you get it, you're kind of done. Why use a substance where there's a chance that they're going to not die?
Well, that's what when I talked about with Brett. when Brett Edwards studied biological weapons, what he brought up was that whenever you see like an old, like a newspaper article, or not an old newspaper article, but like a new news story, and it talks about an old biological weapon, he goes, it's not really meant to kill that person. We have treatments for all these biological weapons, especially the really old stuff. The whole point of it is people who know what that is will know that that was just, when it gets reported, it's like that's a message. That's a, hey, we know, if you use Novichok, there's cures for Novichok. If you get to the hospital in time, it's really hard to kill somebody with Novichok because of all the advanced medicines we have today. But when it gets reported and people assume Russia, it's because they're like, that's a message that we're sending to you. And it is that type of like this deal where it's like other people, like if you know, you know, and if you don't even think twice about it. And that's kind of like, I mean, that's intelligence operations for sure. I mean, Russia still continues with their nerve programs and all these other toxins that go on. I think I mostly know a lot about every single government, at least every country's. I think at least as far as I
Well
possibly
well
can.
well, you had a very interesting podcast that sort of changed my view on the world. I still try and be I still try and be positive and move forward, but
I'm very
you
positive.
yeah, but you had a show with a guy on who was talking about, um, Hiroshima, and,
Oh, Peter Kuznick,
yeah, I think so,
the
and
guy
he
from
was
Untold History of the U.S.
yeah, and he was talking about how, uh, you had I think it was, um, the president at the time during the because it wasn't, it was FDR had just passed away, I think, and Eisenhower, I think, and who Eisenhower was sort of he was even though he was a general, he was sort of anti-war, and he was sort of quoted as saying, I just want this sort of to end, and then you know Hiroshima and Nagasaki get bombed by, um, you know, atomic weapons, and you go, well, somebody had to okay that. He okayed that, and you were talking about why that happened. Why he was like, why? And it's like, did that happen to end the war? And your guest said, if it was Peter, said, no, no, the war was over. Japan had already thrown up their hands. Yeah, and Japan had already thrown up their hands and were asking for amnesty and this and that and stuff. So those didn't need to be dropped at all because Japan was ready to give up. They were ready to give up without concessions. They were ready to just end this. That was a message for Russia. And when I heard that, I went, "What?" And the Peter, I think Peter said, "Look, what Eisenhower was saying was, if we're willing to do this to somebody who's ready to surrender, imagine what we would do to you if you lifted a finger against the US."
Yeah, that's the
And I
most.
just kinda it's his point of view, his perspective, but I kinda went, "Wow,
Yeah,
that's a mind blower, that
it's
one."
it's the most difficult thing about like trying to come at everything balanced, like trying to talk to both sides of this, is that if someone looks into the horribles of Vietnam, there's no way you're going to come out of it if your particular focus is that with a rational perspective that, okay, this is everybody doing it. No, you're going to be like, the US needs to die. Everyone here needs to suffer or pay for the sins that were committed. And it's like, whoa. And then you go to the other side. Well, we had to do, like, I talked to people in intelligence operations. Nigel West straight up told me he studies intelligence operations. He goes, it's a myth that the CIA can never activate on domestic land. Everyone else is like, it's in their charter. So was he lying to me? Yes. Why was he? Because it's just like when I spoke with John Ranley, and John Ranley kind of changed my perspective when I was talking to him. You think drugging people is a thing that we can do? Operation Midnight Climax? You think that's right? And he was like, yeah, but what? Why is it so wrong? And you start kind of talking about it, and you realize people that study the intelligence community, you would think that they would be aggressive against the intelligence community. No, well, they see the rationale because it's not just our organizations; it's every organization. But then look at the people that are being affected, people that are suing the government for MK Ultra projects. MK Ultra was horrible, but at the same time, there's like two different perspectives on that, and that's what makes it really, really difficult. And it makes you more of a balanced person to understand that. But dude, the JFK stuff is like that too. It's like that with every single thing. It's like it's so hard to be balanced when you can only focus on one area of information. I've heard positives and negatives on Nixon, and there are people with two different viewpoints. And it's just like, okay, well, who was Nixon then? And you just start realizing, okay, everybody has like the same kind of idea of the man, but at the same time, everyone goes, well, he was influenced by this and influenced by that. And that's what I think it was so interesting is that the official story has been repeated for so long. You start looking at the underground media when that first started, and particularly DC and Virginia, people went underground to print newspapers and create their own magazines that were being activists against the Vietnam War, and they distributed them at college campuses. And what happened was the FBI, a couple agents went, okay, there's a bunch of this information going out to college campuses and it's creating activists, and we need the war in Vietnam. So what do? Well, they created a fake magazine called The Rational Observer, and this was distributed on academic campuses, Harvard, Yale, and all this. And they go and look at this magazine that says, actually, the war in Vietnam is a good thing. We're bringing democracy. And it just was like a one sided pitch. And then, I mean, there are people that are finding out, like, I had a guy who interviewed all these people, and he goes, that was a fake magazine, right? And they're like, what? And he shows them the FBI documents about this fake magazine that is created. And they go, wow. And it's like, that's been 50 years ago. And now you're just learning that. And it's like you start realizing like there's things in that you might have an idea about that might necessarily not be true. And it's when I told my buddy Jason, if he spent a couple months researching Jonestown, I would talk to him about Jonestown. And he's sending me articles back and forth. Dude, this was a lie and this was a lie. I'm like, okay, I'm going to come at this very, very balanced because I know why they were doing that. But I just want you to research into that. And you start realizing history is told in a form, it's not told necessarily as law. And that's when you kind of boil it down to the basics and you start learning about, meeting organizations with the mafia, J. Edgar Hoover and other people in the FBI that are looking at those mafia people. I mean, death of Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra, the influence into Hollywood, scripts. And you just start realizing it's like, oh, everything is keeping this idea of stability and utopia as best as we can by making sure that we try and cover every base and make sure that there is no plausible or breakaways. And when we do have those breakaways, is when you have a society that shatters. To me, that's fascinating as hell. And I'm like, I don't see that conspiratorial at all. And it's like, okay, well, here's the document that states it. And then even then people go, oh, cool. And then they move on. It's like, well, learn about it. I mean,
It's that's the thing. I mean, one of the things you do that I really appreciate is that when you do your research, you actually read books other than just search the internet kind of thing because when you go online and you see somebody who's like, "Yeah, I found this conspiracy," it's like, what? Your superior Google skills have discovered something that no one else on the planet knew about? Ooh, how did that happen? It's sort of like, no, like you need to read something else other than a Wikipedia page to go, "I found this thing." Because, and again, also you have to be very open-minded about certain things. Like just because something's in print doesn't mean it's true. Whereas, like my ex-wife's mom, like my mother-in-law, she was very much, if it was on TV, it's true. If it's in print, it's true. She honestly believed it. She goes, they would not print lies in a newspaper. They would not do that to the people. She believed this. And so when she read certain, and the problem was she used to read this really trashy newspaper over here that was basically one step above the National Enquirer. And so some of the stuff that was in there, you're like, really? You believe alien? Never mind. I'm not gonna go there, Mom Saunders.
you
You
should
just
look at the propaganda posters that came out during the Industrial Revolution. That shit is I mean, to me, it's fascinating, but you look at it, it's like, who needs education when you can have a job? And it's like a little kid with a construction hat on and he's going into a factory. And you're just like, look, I really get it. But like, and I would honestly, this is where I find history fascinating is when you look at the Industrial Revolution, there's historians of it, and then there's economics experts on it, and you can kind of trace the actual history of the Industrial Revolution on the basis of the money aspect and also the basis of just the historical events we have. But this idea of the Industrial Revolution, that's the most significant point in history where you literally see that there's now this exceptional elite class that starts profitizing more than everybody else. And then from there, it has never, ever really, like, now you kind of seen it where the people that were average or middle class are now probably below, more poor. And then now you see the elite that drop down to what would now back then be like middle class. And it's like you see that, like, okay, they're suffering, and then there's like a cool little political cartoon that was created by Dr. Seuss. Yeah, that guy. And at the bottom rung, it's like these people that are like getting crushed. And then in the middle, or like the second to the bottom, it's like KKK members and like businessmen. And then the third class is like these high elites, like government officials and things of that sort. And then on the top is like this, like these like people in cloaks. And it's like, is that the Illuminati? I don't know. But you get into this point of like, there's this levels of suffering and this idea that equality is the same, and people just base equality on your race. And I can tell you for a fact, I've been a minority in most positions in my life, and it's not just a race thing. It's just about if you get tossed away to the system. Now, there might be a large skew in the aspect of a certain race that might be underlooked or something like that, sure. But it's also like, if you don't play by our fucking rules, we're going to leave you. I don't ever go to a doctor's appointment. I don't ever do a bunch of things that you're regularly supposed to do. And people say, well, you're gonna not be able to take care of yourself. Well, not really. They kind of forgot about me. My doctor calls me up. Oh, he's going to be in vacation, and this appointment was booked 5 months ago. And he goes, "You're going to be on He's going to be on vacation. Can we rebook you?" I was like, "When?" And then they're like, "Uh, February 2nd. Is that a good day?" I'm like, "We're in fucking October." And they're like, February 2nd, it's the only time he's got open. Sure, book it and I'll call you if I can't make it. I'm not going to make it. They don't care. It's that aspect of things where you start realizing that the system is just telling you this is what you're supposed to be doing. And then if you don't follow that, they'll be more than happy to never contact you again. It's like being on an email list. After a while, people either unsubscribe or they stop getting emails. And that's kind of how the system is set up in a sense. I don't think that's crazy to say, but this idea, like, we boil it down to specific groups and everything like that. And I guarantee you, there's definitely specific groups that are more targeted than others. But I just go, everyone's susceptible to suffrage. Everyone's susceptible to being controlled or being manipulated. I mean, fucking the US is one of two countries in the world that advertises pharmaceutical drugs. And just recently, they started talking about opioid overdoses. This shit's been going on for years, but it's a business aspect. Why are you showing it on the TV if people are dying about it? Well, look, take this drug and you'll be okay. You'll forget about it. I was like, fuck.
Yeah, I remember some of the when we were doing commercials back in Canada in the 70s and 80s, or in the 80s and 90s, when they this is sort of back when recording technology wasn't sort of the same it was now, and they needed people who were fast talkers. And you got hired if you could be a fast talker. And it was so, those little, blah 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 blah. At well, now with software, you can have somebody just say that normal and squish it, and it sounds like they're but in the 80s and 90s, you pretty much had to have somebody had to go, this is really fast, and I'm talking really fast, and this is me saying this side effects included. And if you could do that, you had sort of a leg up on people, and it was very interesting, the things that we had to do those sort of disclaimers for. Even toys, had disclaimer stuff. And um and when they brought in the pharmaceutical, you think it's, I remember when they stopped advertising hard liquor in Canada, kind of thing, but but the beer commercials are still all over the place. But they thought, yeah, we'll just look at how good we're being. We're taking alcohol off TV. Well, no, you're not. You're just you just now you're appealing to the masses, because usually the hard liquor ads were um, targeted at more affluent people, people who had a bit more money. Usually, it was usually like, look at, the bar and the club and the good looking girl and the good looking guy and what they're wearing and where they're at, and they're drinking cocktails, kind of thing. Joe Everybody doesn't drink cocktails. Joe Everybody has a beer when they get home. So that, which is like 80% of the people. So they didn't really lose a lot of the market when they just said, we'll just take this off, and we'll keep it in printed magazines, and we'll just so
Well, look at
it's
even rehab facilities. Rehab facilities used to be an elite thing. You would not be able to afford to get in a rehab facility. I think it was like $35,000 back then, would have been like $100,000 today to even get in it just wasn't known. And then rehab facilities eventually, and I think Dr. Drew even talked about this. Rehab facilities are not a place for you to go to get better. Rehab facilities are a place to get you off the drug. When you do not fix the problem in somebody's life, or the issue that's causing them to use the drug to get away from the pain that they might be masking it with, then you're just going to have them go somewhere else. For example, if your house burns down and you get addicted to cocaine because you're living in your car, then we get you off cocaine. Well, you don't have a house still and you're living in your car. So eventually you're just going to find another drug to mask that pain. And I went to school for chemical dependency and then switched over to psychology. So you're like, I'm understanding this. And it's like hard because you're like, oh, fuck, I thought we're supposed to help people. And you get into this aspect of like, well, what's a rehab facility? Well, sometimes they're government funded, but a lot of times it's just getting money and then that's it. They can help you in a sense, but does it really cure you? And that's why there's so many personalized organizations that I'm in support for. I think it's the LSD talk and giving somebody psychedelics is one that I would not do for myself, but I'm happy if someone wants to look at that avenue and try it out. And I think that is one thing in our society that we just know what works and we know this is what has always worked. So this is how we're going to do it. And then we don't ever look at alternatives. And I get it. I'm not an aromatherapy guy. I would never ever fucking do that for myself. I'm going to take whatever. I don't even take really medicine. I'll kind of let my body just beat it. But you look at everything where we've literally shot ourselves in the own foot. The drug that was labeled the horse paste, for instance, that's now being used to treat COVID-19. So that they labeled that and made a bunch of slam articles about it saying people were dying in hospitals. The Rolling Stones had to print a retraction about that. But now the CDC website has that listed there. So it's like, wait, so what was the point of all that? We just got people that are now somehow brainwashed to think that it's still this thing. And I wouldn't even take it if it was recommended. But I'm just saying, you're at this point, it's like you're doing more damage than good. And I know we just switched over to the COVID topic a little bit, but it's like that's a lot of our thing is that we're not just impressionable, but we also look at ideas and things that are said to us as supposed to be fact. And I think what we're supposed to do. But also, we are not talking about what is supposed to be fact. We are supposed to talk about these things and make our own perspective choices and learn and experience other people's perspectives and try and have this discussion about things. And it's like we don't do that in anything. And it's like we're at this point now where everything's revolved into text. And honestly, I couldn't even tell you what's happening right now. I've been so stuck in the fucking 60s for the past longest time.
I hear you. I mean, it's in many ways, I think we really miss out on like when you were talking about cancel culture and stuff the other day, and again, which is it as a generation having when you have cancel culture and just say Me Too and all this stuff and the um, though it is important, some people are just jumping on the bandwagon and they don't really know what they're talking about. And in many ways, when you had like one of my when you were talking about LSD, which I was thinking about this while you were doing the podcast about my some of my favorite books and some of my favorite movies and things that I saw growing up were directly responsible. But, LSD made some of those things directly responsible. Like one of my favorite authors is a guy by the name of Philip K. Dick, who you've heard of. He wrote Blade Runner, but when Blade Runner originally came out, it was called "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep" was the original name of the
It's a
book,
great name.
which is a great name. And he wrote 57 books in 7 years, full novels. So this guy was so stoned on drugs. Um, and in my opinion, he's probably one of the only writers in the world that ever existed that wrote a drug trip. Like he explained a drug trip in about 3 or 4 of his books, like what he was going through. And many of his books are the result of drug trips and the paranoia. He wrote Minority Report, which was what would happen if somebody could predict that I was going to do a crime and they arrest me before it happens. The paranoia from that. The whole point of Blade Runner was who's a replicant and who's not, who's real, who's not. He did Johnny Mnemonic, which was that was when uh, Neuromancer and Cyberpunk was such kind of a big deal, but the whole getting on the net and people know more about you than we really do. And his he wrote this one of my favorite stories he wrote. I can't remember the name, but so I don't want it was basically a murder mystery where these people are friends and neighbors or whatever are dying and disappearing. And at the end of the book, you find out that they're astronauts in a spaceship. And the killer is actually the person he's the only person awake and everyone else is in hibernation. and he's disconnecting everyone one on one because he realizes that they've been traveling for like 400 years, and where they were supposed to go no longer exists, and they're going to keep doing this endless loop of living in this town and doing nothing. So he's decided that he's going to put everyone to sleep. So he becomes this serial killer
Jesus.
in their dream. And so what he does is he enters into the town every so often, and he comes in, and you don't know who it is until the very end, you know, and but he basically, it's revealed to the reader this is what's happening, but the people that are in the book have no idea this is happening. And so it's that whole his whole idea of what's real and what's not. And my favorite my favorite book he ever wrote was probably, I think it's one of his first ones he wrote, and it's called Valis. And I think I've talked about this. In Valis, he basically describes a drug trip. He really does. He believes that God, or the main character of Valis believes that God is this satellite that is orbiting the planet, and Jesus is a projection, a holographic projection from this satellite, and that appears every so often in this bright flashing light, and which it's why he disappears. And when people, you know, imagine going up to him, it was just amazing how we started talking
The
about all this stuff.
the fuck you like looking at, dude? Holy crap! That sounds like the trippiest thing I've ever heard.
Well, exactly. So these are, you know, in his novels, he writes these so many of these stories that are very much what I realize now are very paranoid and very um you don't know what's going on. You're not in control. And there's this whole aspect of I think my favorite story of his, it was the one that won the Hugo Award. It's called uh Flow My Tears, the Policeman Said. And it's very innocuous. It's about a birthday party on Mars, and it starts with someone getting on a helicopter or a travel or ship, and sort of flying across Mars and then landing and going to this party, and then chapter 2 picks up. And you think, well, okay, we're just going to move on. Chapter 2 picks up as the host of the party, and the exact same events occur, but from a different perspective. And then chapter 3 is the wife of the host, and the exact same things are happening, and they're telling totally different stories about the exact same things that are happening. He changes nothing in the story. And so you end up, as a reader, you end up going, well, what's what's real, that what well, who's right? Well, they're all right and they're all wrong at the same time, because they're all looking at this thing that happens at this party from their perspective. And it's sort of like it's that type of idea. He does that where we all have our own way of looking at things, and it's our way, and this is how we see it, but it's not how the rest of the world sees it. And so in many ways, like with the conspiracy theories, which are really cool, some of them, like, it's a good way to I sit back sometimes and I go, do I just think there's like an Illuminati because I want there to be one, because I want someone to blame for all the shit that's going on? Or do I honestly believe that there is someone up there who's pulling some strings? And then I'll have days where I'll go, why would there be? Why is there somebody who up there who actually cares enough to pull strings in the planet? You know, like, who's even, you can look at it as like, when people talk about religion and they talk about God, and they're like, "Oh, God, he made the earth and he left a long time ago. There's nothing happening anymore. He's we're sort of like a fish tank that he's given up on. We're like that atrium that he made, and he went, yeah, that's kind of cool. And you're in my summer home, and then I'm just going to go back to where I am. And we've been on our own for a long time. And then there's other people who's like, oh no, God's watching. He's just stoned as fuck. He's just watching us going, wow, this is so cool. I wonder what would happen if I did this. Ooh, shit. I think that was COVID. Uh, it's okay. You'll be all good. So nobody saw. You know, it's that type of thing where you kind of go where he doesn't know what he's doing, kind of thing. And then you have other ones where he's like Zeus, who doesn't care, kind of thing. And he's throwing lightning bolts down, going, ha ha ha, you guys are fucked. You know, and so because and they're all the gods are sitting up in Olympia and they're laughing. So you have those moments where you kind of go, what is it? I don't know. And I think that's what makes life really interesting, was I don't know. And but it's because of podcasts like you, where you're always looking and watching, it makes me interested to know.
I've
Will I
never
ever find Yeah,
well,
go ahead.
I've never found information that I just wouldn't or I wouldn't, like, I don't know, listen to. Like, I've never found that stopping point. I've definitely, like, I've had some guests, and it's a question I wanna ask them when I speak with them, which I have a few scheduled about, but when you Google their name, it says, like, a conspiracy writer or conspiracy theorist. I'm like, Tom O'Neill worked for The Intercept. The Intercept is not a conspiracy site. It's literally that's like WikiLeaks. That's like all that Snowden stuff. Snowden used to work at The Intercept, if I'm not mistaken. Jefferson Morley, the guy who's suing Biden with the Mary Farrell Foundation to get those documents about JFK, works for The Intercept. Intercept is a journalistic website. It's fucking prime A stuff. But then you look up his name and it says conspiracy writer. And it's like, well, then who owns Wikipedia? And it's like, I started looking into Wikipedia, and now they have stuff like a Democrat or Republican and all this. And I know some of the editors at Wikipedia, and they are part of like the Skeptic Society, which is those people that don't believe things. And it's like, it sucks is because like I've heard Ben Shapiro and Michael Shermer has been on the show, and he wrote a book about conspiracies recently, and he talked about the JFK assassination, and he mentioned this on my show, which was the president gets a massive amount of death threats a day. So, yeah, so it's like it's not crazy to think that, they didn't take some of them at face value. And I go, that's true, but I don't think he ever understood that they destroyed documentation of those. So now they're covering up the bad job that they did do. So I think that also should be brought in as well too. Like I don't think there's like this necessarily this everyone's looking for a devil to burn and a Christ to put on a cross. I don't think it's like that. I just think if we talk about like Illuminati stuff, I do believe that there is a dark, weird stuff that goes on in our government. I could explain to you every single president that had weird shit going on, all the way dating back to Theodore Roosevelt.
And
But I,
it's well, it's
hold
just
on, hold on. I go.
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, you're
Really,
on a ramble, go ahead,
it's
go ahead.
really, really important to talk about the aspect that when we talk about a president that's in position of power for 4 years compared to people that are in his administration that could have been in there for 20 or doing life on the Supreme Court. You talk about the inner workings of people's backdoor trading, like Nancy Pelosi insider trading deals that go on, people that have been in the system for so long, they know how to work the system. That's no different than any other person I've talked to who works in child protective services or any other aspect that talk about you got to learn how to game the system. You got to learn how to fight for what you care about. Okay, well, a lot of things they have to do is medical industries. Okay, to get you at the top of the list, what we got to do is we got to write this in your chart, write this in your chart, write this in your chart, and this should put you on the top of the donor list for a new kidney. Well, you're now cutting past all the people that have been waiting in line. Why did they do that? Because it might be a child that needs a kidney. Good reason, right? Unintended consequences, you're fucking somebody else. And that's kind of how the world goes. I mean, I don't think when Kennedy made a deal with the mob or whatever to go assassinate Castro or whoever's administration did that, nobody fucking told Bobby, and Bobby Kennedy started lighting up the mob, and they mob thought they were getting crossed. Is that an unintended consequence? Yes, it is. Is the world filled with them? Hell yeah.
Remember, it's before the internet, so and I don't think Bobby and Jack weren't tweeting each other.
Well, they definitely pissed off a lot of people in the government because their relationship between brothers was like a bond. They were having like there's pictures of them like talking to each other and everyone else is away. And it's like you are never going to know what they're talking about because that is between two brothers. And that is a bond that cannot be attached to a general or any other friend of the. And I think that's like what you start looking at is like as much as people can say there's coincidences in the world, I don't really believe in coincidences a whole lot, but I can tell you one thing is that there's a lot of unintended consequences. I believe if you start looking at what a government's doing or what something's going on, it's probably because another government's doing it as well too. I mean, the MK Ultra project, there's not any good that came out of it, and the fact that the government hasn't corrected any of the accounts that are on Wikipedia or any descriptions that people have said about it, which means if I called you a liar, Casper, you would correct me and say I'm not a liar. You would say who you are, whatever it is.
Strangely enough, though, I would go, "About what?"
Well,
That would be my first thing because of course I'm a liar. in some things.
Well, when people make assumptions about something and those assumptions are not to be true, you correct those. And the government hasn't corrected the MK Ultra stuff. But I think when you look at the MK Ultra program, look at Russia's programs that they had, look at China's programs that they had, look at other places that might still be going on, and we might still have MK Ultra going on today. And that's what's really weird is that, like, as much as you can say this government's terrible or this government's terrible, I'm like, it's everything. And once you kind of understand that, and I know I get interested in the government stuff so much, but it's because it links into a whole lot of history. And then when you can understand that, like the idea of like everything's rigged is kind of stupid. It's not everything's rigged.
I was just thinking about this the other day, and because you brought up the point when you were talking about the governments, and and again, it's your podcast, so I'm thinking outside the box, but it's something that it's so obvious. But I was thinking, well, everyone always talks about the nasty American government, and the nasty, and or the back in the day it was the Germans and the Russians or Chinese, but you kind of go, is this happening everywhere? Like, is every government filled with conspiracies? And I'd love to talk to the people who are there at the time. Like, I'd love to talk to an Egyptian person and just say, hey, what are the what do you think? Or or a French person, or just someone from, or even someone from Malaysia. The stuff that happens in like Malaysia and the Philippines and stuff. You got, or they wouldn't. I don't know if you saw the stories about that. Whereas I think it was in the Philippines where their crackdown on drugs was, if you were assumed to have anything to do with drugs, you were shot on the street
That's still like
out
that in
front.
Singapore.
Yeah, and so it was, but it kind of changes in um where you
Well, ask someone in China about their government, and they'll tell you their government's awesome and everything that they know is
yeah,
true.
and here you have see, it takes a lot of balls to have a government that can when they talk about population control, and say where they can basically say to a family, we're going to limit the amount of children you have. There, when you have a government that can do that, there's other stuff going on kind of thing. It's like, well, what happens if we have more than one? Well, the way they went about that, like when we found out quite a few things, like when my ex and I were doing IVF to try and have children, one of our options was always adoption, because somebody always says, well, why don't you just adopt? Which is anybody who ever says that to you is like, have you ever tried to adopt ever? Because you can't just say, why don't you just adopt? But we did find out we could buy a Chinese baby girl for 20,000 US. This would have been in,
Christ,
yeah,
$20,000.
$20,000 you could buy, and that's cheap. So $20,000 you could buy a baby girl, and that's important. Baby girl.
Don't they just need a home?
No, they didn't sell the boys.
Oh, that's they're only allowed to have 2 daughters or 1 daughter, I think, in
No,
China
they in China, you're allowed to have 2 children, and they want them to be boys. That's
for the
that's a
army.
fa that's a family thing. Well, also, you can keep the family going if you have boys. So it's that whole, you come down to that whole aspect. Every dad wants their son to have, to go off to a prostitute or something, to enjoy themselves in their first time in the 60s and 70s. This is, we were raised this way. He was like, yeah, we'll go, we'll go get you laid, son. But nobody wanted to be the father of the girl that was going to happen to, kind of thing. Nobody talked about that. So was there a town bicycle man that everybody went to? Like, this, so how did this happen? Where did this sort of, again, when you're talking about conspiracies and things, it's like, so is this all with the same person then? Or is this nobody talking about, the girl? So in with the China thing where we could buy a girl, and again, we decided not to do that because we went, that's going to have so many issues. Like, she's going to know pretty early on she's adopted. So those questions will come up pretty quick. Um, and you can still raise them quite well. But we were like, are we prepared to have that sort of um, thing, which is going to happen, that extra stuff that's going to, because people are going to know right away you've adopted.
I, uh I would probably be labeled a conspiracy theorist, but I don't think I am. I've people that I would say would probably be the most logical and rational people always talk about the grand reset and all that, and I've never brought in the aspect of the grand reset. I've never brought in this aspect of population control. I've never I did, like, jokingly, but I do think it's a good question, it's which is why I asked someone who ran the supply chain, who studied it, and I was like, "Why do they pasteurize milk?" And he gave me a good scientific explanation for it. Literally, that whole thing sounds like, "Why what are they putting in our milk? Why can't we sell raw milk?" We literally pasteurized milk. Then our stomachs got so adjusted to it that we cannot go back to the raw milk. So it's like even if you drink raw milk, you can get highly sick and you can get because before we could have done it fine, but when you introduce that delicacy or this extra thing, now we've adjusted to that's where our bodies cannot adapt back to the raw milk. So that's interesting. But then I asked the question, what about fluoride in water? Why does the government care about my teeth? And then you start learning about like it's cleaning out certain chemicals and all these types of things. And I'm like,
Yeah, yeah, fluoride does something else rather than they tell you it's for your teeth.
but so I go like, there's obviously something else that's you can question things, and it doesn't always have to lead to conspiracy. But like, I always drew the line at when it goes. I think when you look at conspiracies, and there are some people I've avoided having on the show because they do go into like the government's trying to make everybody dumb, and like that's okay if you're like joking around about it. But some people really believe that, and I'm like, I don't think that's necessarily true, but do I believe that they put up obstacles in your way to make sure that you're not successful? I go, I mean, that sounds fine. It doesn't sound very conspiratorial.
If you're trying to make your people dumb, you're gonna get into a lot of problems because if you people need a certain level of intelligence to be able to be instructed to do things, because if you instruct someone to do something and they're like, "Huh? You're doing it," you're just gonna keep doing whatever you're doing, and so you need a certain level of intelligence, but it's what I would say when you were talking about the milk, it's very interesting. Like you had companies like UNICEF, organizations like UNICEF, or which were delivering powdered milk to like Africa and things like that. And what they don't cover is nobody could use the milk because they're lactose intolerant. In Asians and Africans, for the most part, are lactose intolerant. Part of that is what you were talking about, the stuff that we've put in the milk for us so that we can have because our bodies have adjusted so much that raw milk now would make us quite ill, was doing the same thing to so they had all this powdered milk that went over to Africa, and nobody could use it just because it just made them sick.
Hmm.
So it's one of those things where you talk about, the altruism and what's going to happen. It's sort of like it's almost like when people talk about the cancel culture now or cultural appropriation. That is such a lovely word. You gotta go, do you have any because usually somebody who's talking about cultural appropriation is some guy or from Kansas who's never left the country, maybe even never left the state, who's talking about, "You can't do that. That's cultural appropriation. You're pissing those people off." And it's like, "No, you're not," but we don't know. I find it very interesting, for example, where, say, somebody's wearing a kimono and it's like you're just like, "You're offending the Japanese people because you're wearing a kimono." And then you ask Japanese people and you go, "What do you think of them wearing a kimono?" "I think it's great. They're sharing our culture."
Yeah. I mean,
What the
I believe
yeah.
that that appropriation thing. I was like, a lot of people exceeding that culture on. It's weird how the Western, I guess, society thinks of that and kids. Um,
It
we think of that really weirdly. Like when I spoke with Les Unite, the guy from the voluntary human extinction movement way back,
yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah,
and he was
yeah.
saying like it's a Western idea that's brainwashed into you to have children. I'm like, you know what? That is something where it kind of makes a little bit of sense. And it's not even like a conspiracy like population control, but when you start examining like why do so many people like are now rejecting the idea of having kids and don't want to have kids? Well, I mean, we were pressured for so long, like you want to get married, have a family, and that was always like the religious idea that was kind of instilled into you. And then when you
Pretty
kind of
much
start
it was sort of like why churches were against, homosexuality, like the uh, LGBTQ, is that the
LGBTQ plus.
Q plus that the whole community was they were basically like, the whole point is to have children. You can't have children, so you were an abomination. And you're kind of like, and again, you look at it and you go, well, why do we need to have children? Well, the species needs to expand. I think we're doing just fine. Like,
Yeah, we could probably do with a little bit less. I think you'll probably have more people that'll You know, you'll still have your exceptional people that'll have kids at like 16 or 20, but then you'll have other people that'll just have kids when they're more established. But I mean, you get into an aspect when you look at education systems. Why did a person graduates college at 26, spent 4 years in there, and each year they spend $20,000 going to college, and now they're in severe amount of debt that they have to pay off for the rest of their life to get hopefully a good job, which was the reason why they went to college. Then they go and try and enter the job market, and the job market's fucked. So you can't get a job, and the job you're trying to get a job, and you end up working at McDonald's, and now you're in such a massive amount of debt. Do I believe that's a conspiracy? Do I believe that's a government organ totalitarian system? No. What it is unintended consequences. Nobody paid attention to the fucking job market. Economy went to shit because of all these other things that we. And this is where I go, America, for the love of God, take a seat on the bench. For Christ's sake, we don't have to get involved in every goddamn problem.
There are a couple people on the net where you listen to them chat, and again, eye-opening conversations were about. They talk about the education system and about how it's drummed in us we need to go to university, and it's drummed in us we need advanced education to do well. And when I was in or high school, there was this they were bringing in things like shop, woodworking, stuff like that. And the people that took shop and woodworking and stuff were always sort of looked down upon by everyone else in the school because they weren't basically what they were doing is they were doing trades. And then once they got to high school, they weren't going to go to university. They were going to go to like work in the garage. They were going to become plumbers. They were going to come. And now you have plumbers who are charging $80 an hour
You
because
know
they
that because
can't.
you were dealing with it recently.
Well, no, but it's that whole thing where you have there where they was really frowned upon, and even nowadays where people are like, no, 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 there's there's ads where it's like and you mentioned it earlier. Um, you said something, and I went that just ties into this so well. Where you when you're talking about the Industrial Revolution, what did you say? What was the poster that you saw where
Oh, the who needs education when you can have a job?
E it's exactly that, where people were going, "So you're saying if you can go get a job, you won't be educated?" Well, basically what they're doing is they're teaching experience on the job kinda thing as you go. And are these people uneducated? Like, someone like there are people out there who are smarter than me, who know more things than I do or more, bigger numbers or maybe more words or that than I have. Does it mean I'm not educated? No, because I live my life and I've read books and done stuff but a lot of my education is life experience. It's not anything I learned in university. In fact, most of my university classes I've forgotten. I don't know what I took in university. Jesus Christ, my degree or whatever. And so but you're right, so it's like why do I have to go to school to get a why do I need a student loan to go to school? And why is it frowned upon so much if I want to go into a trade? And in many ways, trades are needed, like plumbers and carpenters and people who are skilled with their hands.
Well, that stems back from ancient Greece. We still have this relationship of wanting scholars and hoping that these scholars would be people that would make our society look smart and everyone would walk around in a fucking toga. It doesn't make sense. I think social media really has impacted that a lot with the creation of influencers and movie aspects of things like that. No one wanted to be an actor back in the day. Nobody had an aspiration to be an actor, but actors were worshiped like gods. But then you would look at the Hollywood 10, people that are getting interviewed by the FBI and the CIA, seeing if they had any communist roots and how dangerous it was to support something that you believe
Oh,
in fear that you wouldn't get a career in Hollywood.
they were police. Like one of the things I told you about one of the guys, I did a play over here with a guy by the name of Richard Johnson, who um, he was married to Kim Novak for a time, and he was involved with Sinatra. He was referred to as the silent member of the Rat Pack. And so he was involved with all those guys. Sammy Davis Jr. He has a great story about how Sammy Davis Jr. really lost his eye. That's a that's another story altogether. But he said when he came over from the UK, where he's from, he's a British actor, and he was pretty much lined up to be the next James Bond, and he went over to the good looking guy, and uh, he was actually living with Kim Novak, and he was approached by these couple guys, suits from this, they're like, "Sir, we represent the studio." And they're like, "Yes." And he's like, um, "The studio has other plans for Miss Novak, and those plans do not include you. Now, it is already out in the public that you are living together in sin with Miss Novak. So you have two options. You can either marry Miss Novak, or you can leave the country and we will never allow you back into the US ever again." And so his option was to marry a friend uh, who was actually involved with Sammy Davis Jr. at the time, uh, or um, or get kicked out of the country. And this was the studio. These are people from, so the studio ran actors. They didn't have a lot of freedom. Like some of them, like there were cleanup control. There's like, like when you think about like Rock Hudson and all the guys, like Errol Flynn, Nazi sympathizer. He that was a huge thing that came out later, kind of thing. But at the time, the the studios had people who went around and cleaned up that shit. So nobody knew about that. And you were told to behave and do stuff. And it was almost like it wasn't until, like, you had some firecrackers and stuff, but it was like until like the 60s and the 70s where you had your Oliver Reeds and your stuff, like going on, going on interviews and dropping your trousers and, being so drunk that you can't stand up. And this was, and stoned. And this was such an awesome thing. It's like, hey, look at these guys, and Peter O'Toole's and, who, this was happening all the time. Like, you had big heavy drinkers in Hollywood, but that was hidden. Like Spencer Tracy, um, a lot of these guys showed up on set drunk, and that was just like, you just didn't talk about it.
I feel like that would be more towards the end of or the middle of the 70s. Because when J. Edgar Hoover died was when the FBI got a new director, and there was a less push on Hollywood as much. It was more about a push to news stations and things of that sort. Because back then, when they were doing FBI movies, there was a list. The FBI agent could shoot as much as they want, but the bad guys can only shoot a couple of times and they had to miss. There's a reason why whenever the FBI agents are involved in the movie, you're programmed to think, oh, the badasses are here. Well, J. Edgar Hoover made sure that if they made an FBI film, if they had an FBI agent in a film, we checked out who that actor's background was. If they had any separations, any domestic violence, any types of things that were looked, if they were homosexual, nope, can't be an FBI agent. I don't want him anywhere near this film. He could be a bad guy, but he can't be an FBI agent. And they handpicked people. Eventually, they got to this point where so many people were dealing with a scandal or drugs or drinking that he was like, we got to find some people and tell them in like a contract that they'll get paid separately from their acting career by the government to make sure that they kept this perfect, back history lifestyle. And it was like, it was just
So they could do it. Yeah.
strange. Yeah. Cause they
I think
needed,
it was,
well, once they found an FBI guy for a movie, they were like, well, shit, he's a rarity. He doesn't do anything. He just goes home and sleeps. And, he's a family man. Let's keep him that way. So let's pay him extra money and make sure he stays like that.
that's a very interesting thing. There's a reason why we look at certain actors and go, they kind of did the same thing always. They were always cast in the same thing. They were, the term is typecasting, but at the same time, certain actors, they were, they rallied against typecasting, but other ones were cast that way because of exactly what you've just said. They had an image they needed to upkeep, and they so they didn't play the bad guys. They didn't do the stuff, like, it was really, it was an interesting time when you actually saw certain actors switch from being the good guy to being the bad guy. Because normally that didn't happen. You were always the good guy, and that's always the bad guy. And that's just all, that was how the movies went, kind of thing. And it was a very, yeah, from an acting point of view, it was great to see, someone who's normally the hero be the villain, kind of thing. But it was very hard for the people to watch that and go, I don't know if I like that, because they're always the good guy. And so it's just our take on it. But yeah, I can just imagine how they were approached by, but again, that's another talk for another thing. But that's that's why I find these, we've covered so.
I know. Real quick before we wrap up, because we are going to wrap up, and I enjoy talking to you. I love having you on. I got to ask about Sammy Davis's eye. What happened to Sammy Davis's eye? Is it a long story? Is it a short story?
No, it's a fairly short story. Now, this is just hearsay according to Richard Johnson, who's passed away, so I'm gonna pass it on. But he took us out one night. We were having an Indian meal out in a a place in Eastern England in the Black Country, uh, and so we're sitting down. There's four of us, four actors, and he's telling us all these stories about himself and about what it was like, you know, being younger, being married to Kim, and and then he said, now about Sammy, what happened was Sammy Davis Jr. was who famously is known, you know, Frank Sinatra proponent of him said, you know, if you're not going to if Sammy can't play, I'm not, you know, I'm not, you know, playing here. We won't stay here if Sammy can't stay here, that kind of thing. But he was approached by the studios and around the same time and said, Mr. Mr. Davis Jr., sir, we have other plans for Miss Novak, and you are not in those plans. You need to stop seeing her because it's just not in our. She needs a different type of thing because they were grooming her to be something else for Hollywood, and your private lives pretty very much carried over into your public lives, and he refused. So what ended up happening was a couple guys from the studio drove him out into the middle of a desert and beat him so badly that his eye fell out of his head. It was just damaged. Like they cracked his skull. They did the stuff. Now the what the papers say was he was in a car accident. Now, is this true? I don't know, but hearing it from someone who was sort of kind of there brings you go conspiracy. I don't know. Now I could be, you know, I could have somebody from the, you know, from his family going, "You don't know what you talking about," you know, get on my face. But this is again, and I don't think, you know, Peter wouldn't have, or not Peter, Mr. Johnson. He wouldn't have told us this story if he didn't think we'd pass it on, kind of thing. Because he did say, "No, this is a hush hush," you know, kind of thing. But he just now this is when he was there, and because he was his relationship with Kim Novak, because he'd been married to Kim Novak, because so while they were married, Kim Novak is seeing Sammy Davis Jr. So there was all this stuff going on there, and it was just yeah, Richard Johnson, and so when you hear that, you kind of go, yeah, I could maybe see it, kind of thing, and also because of there was so much, you know, the racial tension and stuff going on during that time. It could have escalated things into, but basically, yeah, Richard said they beat him so badly and left him that, you know, when they brought him to a hospital and said he's been in a car accident.
That's crazy.
And then, you know, Richard Johnson said after, because he spoke to Sammy and says, "Hey, car accident?" And he went, "No, not a car accident. A couple guys with big feet."
Big feet.
And you
Um,
kind of went, there you go.
that's good. I like that. All right,
Great way to
Casper, where
end it.
can people find your links?
My links are just I'm on all your social medias. I'm the only Casper Michaels with a K on all the on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.
All right. Well, I'm going to link it all in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting again, my friend. And I'll talk to everyone on the next episode of Out of the Blank.